The movie opens with an introduction to Blackwood Pharmaceuticals, a clinic that uses volunteers to research how antidotes affect the human body before distributing them to the public. Claire, a volunteer, arrives at the clinic with her small luggage. She notices that Blackwood Pharmaceutical has a chic and modern feel to it, just as the voiceover claims. Claire arrives at her room, where she meets Allison, her roommate. Allison has a jovial personality and is open about all her feelings as she wants to share all of that with Claire. However, in contrast to that, Claire is rather reticent and not the type who wants to talk about her experiences or feelings. Allison keeps talking, and when Claire can't bear her endless chatter, she brings Allison to a halt, claiming that she needs some rest as it's been a long night for her. Allison immediately acknowledges her wrong and apologizes. Just then, to Claire's dismay, all participants are then asked to convene in the exam room, interrupting the rest she would have hoped to have. In the examination room, Claire is surrounded by other volunteers. They complain about having no phone service, and some suspect it's done on purpose to prevent them from disclosing the activities of the place. Just then, Dr. Burke arrives. She introduces herself as the person who will be supervising the whole trial. She begins to reiterate why they are there, and explains that it is a Phase 1 safety study for abexatine BRN-14, which will take a total of 5 days. She further explains that dosage begins at 25 milligrams and would eventually rise to 85 milligrams in the end. It's a double-blind trial, and all the volunteers would be closely monitored for any irregularities or side effects. However, side effects shouldn't occur, as it is a fairly minimal dose, so smooth sailing is expected. A question is then raised by one of the volunteers. He asks if any of them are going to have a chance to see outside at all, and it's a strong no from the doctor, as she makes it clear to all of them that all participants are confined to only one floor for the duration. This causes a stir amongst the volunteers, as being restrained isn't pleasant to them. However, in the doctor's defense, she's not the one who makes the rules. Just then, nurses begin to pass pills in cups for the participants to swallow. Claire watches on as she appears to be unsettled. It gets to her turn, and after a long, hard look at the pills, she swallows it. Later, the group shares breakfast. Claire walks up to one of the tables to have her meal. The people at that table don't recognize Claire, so they reckon she must be a new joining. They also tease about her probably joining because she sought to have some easy money. However, Claire claims to have needed the money to meet certain needs of hers. Claire begins her medical procedures, taking various tests and providing samples of her urine. The nurse also asks if she has any side effects, but she doesn't yet. However, the frequent need for that much bodily liquid from her is draining for Claire. Later, Claire is hoping to get some rest in her room, but she is left dismayed when her roommate Allison walks in. Initially, Claire pretends to be asleep, hoping that Allison will leave her alone. However, this strategy fails, and Claire finds herself in a conversation with Allison that she would have hoped to avoid. Just as Claire has had enough of Allison's incessant talking, she yells at her, but then she chokes on her words and instantly rushes to the restroom. As Claire walks out of the restroom, she bumps into Amir, who is doing the same. The two chat briefly. Amir can sense the exhaustion in Claire and claims it's all for a worthy cause. Claire, concerned, inquires what the antidote is for, and Amir explains that it has multiple uses and goes ahead to list them. Amir reveals that he's a medical student who's seeking to prove a point, thus volunteering, but now he's beginning to question his life choices. That night, Claire has trouble falling asleep as she tosses and turns in bed. Eventually, she gets up and goes to another room where all the other volunteers are gathered. Claire tells them that she had trouble sleeping, and it turns out that they had also experienced the same issue. This is contradictory to the doctor's reassurance earlier that the whole process would be smooth sailing, and it becomes a concern for the group. The group has now been awake for 30 hours. They engage in leisure activities to pass time. Claire and Allison begin to slowly get along as they play chess while they chat. On the other hand, Dr. Burke is beginning to raise some alarming concerns to her superiors. After, Claire and Allison come across a room filled with lab rats. As they stand outside the room watching the rats closely, they have a slight debate on whether the rats should live in a cage or have their freedom on the streets. This conversation slowly clashes with Claire's reality, as she claims she'd rather live in a cage with the assurance of a meal and safety than be out in the streets alone, fending for herself. The group has a brief meeting with Dr. Burke the next day. She informs them that the parameters have changed, and they should now try as hard as they can to not fall asleep. Just as she dismisses them, Amir tries to approach her and talk to her, but she immediately instructs him to go back and join the others. Later, Claire has a session with Dr. Burke in an MRI scanner. As she's gently rolled into the machine, the whole process triggers her claustrophobia, and she begins to have a panic attack as her heart races rapidly. Although the doctor reassures her that everything will be fine, the situation becomes more tense for Claire, and she begins to plead for help in tears. After the traumatizing experience in the MRI scanner, Allison tries to help Claire take her mind off things. Although Allison's kind gesture initially annoys Claire, it ends up helping her as she bursts into laughter. The trial becomes increasingly concerning over time. Firstly, there is concern about the participants' lack of sleep, as it is known that sleep serves a purpose, and they are being asked not to fall asleep. Additionally, the increase in antidote dosage is alarming, as the maximum is supposed to be 85 milligrams. Just as they raise these questions, the doctor arrives in time to clear the air. She appreciates their concerns following the new adjustments and understands if any of the participants want to leave. However, there's a bonus payment for anyone who can see through the whole process until the end. A tempting fee of 30,000 euros each. This offer of 30 grand excites the entire group, as the sound of those figures lifts them to their feet in celebration. However, Claire and Amir seem to be the only ones slightly unsettled by the whole situation. Amid all the celebration, Claire just sits in the corner all by herself. Allison goes to meet her, bothered that she's not joining their mini party. Claire then shares her worry. She finds it odd that these people are just willing to give them all that money. However, Allison doesn't see things from her viewpoint and thinks they're just lucky. Allison manages to convince Claire to join the celebration, and Claire hesitatingly joins. As they dance together for a few minutes, Claire begins to feel tired and decides to go meet Dr. Burke for an examination. Meanwhile, Dr. Burke, on the other hand, is trying to convince her superiors to stop the trial, claiming that the immune system of the participants has gone haywire. However, they insist on her increasing their dosage and observing the eventual outcome. Paul, one of the participants, begins counting his eggs before they hatch. He envisions how far an amount like 30,000 euros would take him. Allison asks Claire what she plans to do with her share of the money, but Claire doesn't have much planned. On the other hand, Allison sees a future outside of Blackwood with Claire, but Claire doesn't share the same vision. She claims not to see the possibility of them hanging out in the real world. These words come across as sharp to Allison. Claire notices that she might have hurt Allison's feelings and tries to make amends, but a hurt Allison just excuses herself. On the other side of things, a curious Amir sneaks into the doctor's office. In the process, he overhears a conversation she has on the phone with a mysterious individual, whom she threatens to deny any form of accountability for the participants' future well-being due to the drastic measures her superiors are forcing her to take. Just as she leaves her office upset, Amir makes his way in stealthily. He opens her computer and makes some disturbing discoveries, which he considers copying onto a flash drive. On the other hand, Claire feels overwhelmed with guilt, and so she decides to apologize to Allison, who is seated by herself away from the rest of the group. As Claire slowly approaches Allison to apologize, she notices that Allison is motionless and unresponsive. With each passing second and every attempt to get Allison to open her eyes, Claire grows increasingly worried. Allison, who is still motionless with her eyes tightly shut, suddenly begins to bleed through her nose and then her eyes. Within a matter of seconds, Allison's whole face is covered in blood. Claire panics and draws the attention of the rest of the group, who immediately gather around, unable to help Allison's condition. Allison falls to the ground as if having a seizure, her whole face still covered in blood, and unfortunately, she doesn't survive the outcome. It's a scary experience for the group, who just stare in shock and disbelief. Their eyes meet Dr. Burke's, who has been watching all along. Fear is written all over the doctor's face, and she immediately attempts to flee. Suddenly, at that moment, a red light comes on, and the voiceover begins to activate a lockdown mode. The atmosphere immediately shifts to an anxious and tense one, as everyone instantly makes their way to the exit, and the voiceover begins a countdown to lockdown. The doctor is ahead of the group as everyone races to the door. 4 seconds to lock down, and the door begins to shut. As the doctor tries to squeeze through, she almost makes it out of the door. However, the tremendously sharp edges of the door pierce through the woman's belly, stopping her in her tracks. The group helps pull her out of the door, but not before the damage is done. As she falls to the ground, groaning in pain and covered in blood, she manages to speak as she apologizes to the group before losing consciousness and passing away. The lockdown is in effect, and in that tense moment, Amir rushes to the group. They try to brief him on all that has happened, including Allison's attempt to escape. However, Amir quickly warns them not to fall asleep. He informs them straight up that if they fall asleep, they'll never wake up. Randomly telling people they're going to lose their lives if they fall asleep isn't very demure, but it's a truth that they need to be aware of. They have to stay awake until they're able to escape there and find help. Amir further informs them that regarding the doors, they won't open until 24 hours when the clock runs down. So unfortunately, they're trapped in these 4 walls. He offers them some smelling salts to help them stay awake through the night, and also warns against taking stimulants, as that would only aggravate their condition. It's going to be a long night for the team, and everyone is doing all they can to stay awake. Claire is still shaken by what happened to Allison, but Amir offers her emotional support while he examines her. The results of the examination appear to be unsettling for Amir, and he immediately asks Claire to leave. As Claire walks away, she's unsteady in her steps. She takes out her phone and decides to make a video dedicating it to her mom, but changes her mind and deletes the video. Claire then proceeds to the room where all the lab rats are caged up and decides to release one of them. However, the rat she frees doesn't appear excited to be leaving its cage, and so it heads back into its cage. Chaos strikes the group as one of the participants. Ray runs out of smelling salts and panics as he goes around begging the others. The whole situation heats up, and Ray is left without smelling salts in his bid to stay awake, or rather, stay alive. Meanwhile, Amir is working hard to find a solution to their predicament. In the process, he begins to have hallucinations, which he attributes to being awake for so long. Everyone begins to face their various demons, as Claire keeps hearing a woman singing her a lullaby, telling her to fall asleep. Marcus arrives in time to bring Claire back to reality, and most importantly prevent her from falling asleep. He offers her moral support, drawing from his own life experiences. 9 hours have passed, but to the group, it feels like an eternity. Marcus, who had earlier proven to be tough to Claire, now begins to struggle. He begins to hallucinate, and eventually falls asleep. The group eventually finds his body, and they are filled with fear and dismay. Claire, suddenly finding the courage from nowhere, goes to motivate the group. She tells them that they can't just sit around, hoping to be rescued by the same people who have them trapped, and they should find a way out themselves. Claire believes that breaking through the walls of the building might provide an exit. However, Amir disagrees, stating that the entire facility is sealed. Despite his warning, the group decides to break through the wall. Ultimately, they discover that Amir was correct, and their efforts were in vain. Aggravation fills the air as a frustrated Ray suggests that they take stimulants. Claire tries to remind him that Amir had warned against it. However, Ray begins to raise questions about Amir. His surprising prediction that cutting through the walls would be useless, and just his overall knowledge about Blackwood in general. Ray claims to have been around longer than anyone else, yet he doesn't even have half the knowledge about the place, like Amir. On the other hand, Claire had gone to check up on Amir. She finds him in an awkward position as he hands her a letter, revealing that he was the one who had accidentally caused the lockdown. The hopeless man, filled with guilt, attempts to fall asleep, but Claire immediately rushes to stop him. She doesn't care that he caused all that has happened, but believes that he can save them. Fortunately, Claire is able to give Amir some motivation, and he immediately has a plan to help them get through. Just as Claire rushes to share the news about the hope of survival with the others, she bumps into Paul on the way. He shares his and Ray's concerns about Amir. Claire finds it hard to believe, but Paul has evidence. He has found the same stimulants Amir had warned them not to take in Amir's belongings. Suddenly, the lights go off. Paul and Claire team up to go to the MRI room, where Paul claims to have seen the tripped fuses. They turn on their flashlights and make their way there. However, Claire is battling hallucinations. Paul tries to help her by telling her to focus on his voice alone, but it's a big ask. The voices in Claire's head telling her to close her eyes are loud and firm. As the voices become louder, the false visions become clearer, and Claire sees a terrifying image of Paul. She screams loudly in fear, and fortunately the lights come back on. Paul, however, is seated on the floor with his eyes shut. Claire immediately rushes to him with smelling salts, and he wakes up. The group confronts Amir. They question his whereabouts, and he claims to have gone to find the fuses to turn the lights back on. They accuse him of taking stimulants as Paul found empty bottles of it on him, but he justifies that by claiming he had only emptied the bottle as a precaution. A terrified Amir begins to back away from the group. However, Ryan sneaks up behind him and hits him across the face, and he falls to the ground as a result. Ryan and Paul team up and tie Amir up. Amir denies being responsible for the power outage, but an enraged Ryan won't let him speak. Ryan demands Amir to admit that he's working for Blackwood, but again, Amir claims innocence. Amir begins to plead for them to untie him. He claims they're exhausted as a result of all that has happened and aren't thinking properly. Meanwhile, Ryan suspects Amir to be up to something. He even suggests the possibility of Amir not working alone and having others working with him in the facility and closely monitoring them. Ray then decides to get the truth of Amir, whatever means he can, even if it involves violence. Vanessa supports Ryan's decision, but Claire can't believe the words spewing out of their mouths. Claire tries to convince them otherwise, but their minds are made up, insisting that Amir has something to hide, and they have to get the truth out of him, one way or another. Claire tries to get Paul on her side, and he agrees that hurting Amir is wrong. However, Ryan has his mind made up, and he makes his way to Amir with a blade in his hands. Claire tries to stop him, but he pushes her out of his way, with so much force that she lands on the ground. Ryan approaches Amir, threatening to hurt him anytime he withholds the truth from him. Ray is furious and looks to mean what he says, but luckily, Claire is able to bring him to a halt by claiming Amir has a cure for them. Amir affirms this, claiming to have a solution for them. However, an unconvinced Ryan refuses to believe a word Amir says, and accuses Amir of probably just trying to take them out on the spot this time. Claire immediately volunteers to be a test subject for Amir, hoping to spare the poor man's life. Paul and Claire serve as Amir's hands in the laboratory, as the young man is still tied up and closely monitored by Ryan. Meanwhile, Vanessa confronts Ryan secretly. She accuses him of tripping the fuse as she saw him do it earlier, causing the power outage. Ryan claims he had only done it so Amir would fall asleep, and he could prove that he wasn't on the pills like them. A concerned Ryan asks if Vanessa is going to tell the others the truth. To Ryan's surprise, Vanessa shows him a sedative, which she claims to be fast-acting. She hopes to use it on Amir when Claire is distracted, so they can finally know if he's lying or not. An impressed Ryan commends Vanessa for her smarter plan. Paul is not doing badly as an Amir 2.0 mixing up the solution for the group, which Claire would be testing first. Claire asks Amir to walk her through the whole process. And he does. The formula is meant to make Claire stroke out and, at the same time, treat the stroke and bring her back. The downside to it, however, is that there are high chances of her never making it out of the stroke. But Claire is unfazed by the bad news. Paul finishes up the formula, and Claire rolls up her sleeves, ready for a shot at it. Amir, who is still tied up, guides Paul through the whole process from a distance. Meanwhile, just as planned with Ryan, Vanessa tries to use the sedative on Amir, while everyone is distracted with Claire. As she quietly approaches Amir to give him a sedative, she suddenly falls to the ground. Her spirit seems to leave her body and she sees the others rushing to help her. Then, a frightening figure with horns appears in the shadows and she screams. Meanwhile, she starts bleeding from her face and she begins to shake uncontrollably. While all the chaos unfolds, Amir begins to laugh maniacally. Claire is triggered by this laughter as she rushes to him, yelling that he stops. Claire then makes her way to the door to see how much time they have left. When she approaches the time board and has a look at it, her vision is blurred. Instead of the time, she sees "Good night" displayed on it. Claire is now hallucinating. As she begins to hear voices again, Claire fights to stay awake, and after a heavy struggle, she manages to take a sniff of the smelling salts. Later, Amir is left alone to face his hallucinations. He keeps seeing images of Dr. Burke trying to manipulate him, but Amir struggles to not be overcome by the encounter. Meanwhile, Ryan sits privately with Vanessa's body, apologizing. In her pocket, he finds a piece of paper, and he opens it to read its contents. It's the note Amir had earlier given to Claire. Ryan, enraged, goes to confront Amir. Immediately, Amir is confronted by Ryan with the note, and he screams for help. On the other hand, Paul and Claire find an exit. Just as Claire is about to rush to the others to share the good news, Paul stops her in her tracks, claiming that they could just run away, leaving the two behind. As he claims, Ryan and Amir are just liabilities. Claire hears screams and immediately rushes back to the others. They find Amir, covered in blood with a blade in his hands, and an unconscious Ryan on the floor. Terrified, Claire pleads with Amir, but he's out of control, manipulated by a hallucination of Dr. Burke. Immediately, Claire and Paul run for their lives, with Amir furiously on their tail. Paul arrives at a room first and shuts the door, denying Claire access. Claire bangs the door, pleading for Paul to let her in, but he walks away. Unfortunately, the room Paul finds refuge in catches fire while he makes a video recording, documenting his experiences. It's now a fight for survival for Claire, as she is left face to face with Amir. It's an intense battle between the two, and just then, the lockdown comes to an end. Amir makes his way to the exit, but unfortunately meets his demise as a group of armed men attack him. Claire, who was on the brink of falling asleep, is woken up by the sound of the loud gunshot. She immediately goes into hiding as the armed men go around the building, searching for any survivors. There's no way out for Claire as the men plan to regroup at the exit. Just in that moment of despair, Claire finds the bodies of the others in plastic bags. She immediately rubs some of the blood on Amir's face on hers, and quickly slips herself into one of the available plastic bags and zips it shut. The men return to pick up the bodies and place them in the back of a van. There in the dark van, Claire still fights her hallucinations. As she manages to get out of the plastic bag, the men in the front seat catch a glimpse of her covered in blood, and they crash the van. Only Claire survives, and so she makes her way out of the van. Outside, there's a ray of sunshine, one that Claire had greatly missed and hoped to see again. She's weak, and her strength can no longer carry her as she falls to the ground, losing consciousness. 4 months later, the malpractices of Blackwood are discovered. Only one with a chance of survival in a coma, and the remaining 6 are gone. The reporter explains that Blackwood apologizes for the misdeeds of Dr. Burke and sends their condolences to the families of the deceased. The movie ends with a tense atmosphere as Claire, who is in a coma, suddenly opens her eyes.